Our next speaker is Kirthi Jayakumar. Kirthi Jayakumar is a peace activist, is a communicator, a writer, an advocate for women and human rights issues, and also she is the founder of the Gender Security Project, which I hope you will look at after this webinar, which focuses on preventing gender-based violence and encourages people to share their experiences through podcasts and share advocacy efforts. So Kirthi is now going to talk about her experiences responding to gender-based violence in India and some of the work she's been doing with the Gender Security Project. Please, participants, stay on. Immediately after Kirti's presentation, we'll go to the question and answer session, where you'll be able to interact directly with the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Emilomo, and special thanks to all of the speakers for enlightening and educating us on the respective topics you talked about. I am not going to make a presentation. I'm instead going to speak a little bit because a lot of what I'm sharing is anecdotal. A lot of the research is still underway to understand the extent of data and the extent of violence that's prevailed against women, against people of non-binary gender identities across the world during lockdowns because of COVID. So my presentation is largely going to center on how we responded to gender-based violence through a couple of anecdotes, and then go on to make a very compelling case for the need to employ, I hope what would be a very compelling case, for the need to employ gender mainstreaming strategies in responding to instances of gender-based violence and increased instances at that during times such as a pandemic. So I live and work in India, and I run a foundation and initiative called the Gender Security Project, which works at the cross-section of the women, peace and security agenda through research, reportage, and documentation. When the lockdowns began in my country, we went through what is globally known, so far as my understanding permits, is one of the strictest lockdowns with the inception of COVID in the country. Now, this lockdown began with a 21-day complete closure of the entire country, which meant that absolutely nothing was functioning as per normal. And then following that, there were several degrees with which parts of the country began to open up and several states continued to lock down. So the experiences of women in India cannot be homogenized to one, neither can the experiences of non-binary people. So I'm going to try to give you as many examples of what actually transpired over these 6 months since the lockdown began. So when India went under lockdown, we saw two different kinds of violence unfold, as is the case across the world. But one form of violence was structural violence, where with the structures and systems in place, several communities that are already unfairly disadvantaged continued to actually face greater disadvantages. And these included women and non-binary people. What happened with the lockdown was a massive mass migrant crisis, which caused for people to leave cities and go walking to their home country, hometowns and home villages in search of what they call home. Because urban living in India does not have place for migrant labor during times like a pandemic, where people have been forced to live in very densely populated areas and social distancing and physical distancing became the norm, to live and continue to live in what was considered a temporary home was no longer feasible. And with the migrant crisis, a hidden and unaddressed crisis to date continued in the form of increased domestic violence, increased gender-based violence, both in the form of overt as well as covert violence. So along with this, with structural violence, there was also increased cultural violence. We noticed an increase in instances of child marriage. We noticed an increase in instances of FGM, or female genital mutilation, even if it was for a specific community alone. We also noticed an increase in marital rape, increase in honor-based violence and culture-based violence, such as forced marriages. There was an increase in the domestic burden on women as well, essentially because the whole idea of work from home did not change the reality that the domestic burden had to continue to be borne by women. With the migrant crisis, with the increased displacement of communities moving out on the streets, the burden was also incredibly heavy on women who are also in transit. Exposed and vulnerable on the one hand to the disease, several women and non-binary persons were forced to live in households with abusive perpetrators or travel back to households with abusive members of their family with no redress in sight. So when the lockdown happened, naturally, there was no access to shelter homes, there was no access to liaisons that could offer support, and the police, as well as medical service providers, were stretched thin. As a result, there were a spike in the number of instances where women bore the violence and continued to live on. Suicides skyrocketed, and mental health impacts were also consequently high. So in the course of this time, we also noticed another phenomenon, one that's explained best by intersectionality. While overall there was an increase in violence targeting certain gender identities by certain gender identities, the intersectional realities that complicated their lived experiences, be that because of caste, be that because of class, be that because of their migrant status, be that also because of their linguistic status, depending on the state they were in, if they were away from their home states. Now, this exacerbated the extent of violence they faced. Not only were they facing violence of an immediate and an overt nature from those that were perpetrating this against them, but also the state and the system and the law and the security sector, which had already stacked up its prejudices against these communities. So when the increase of domestic violence took place, we did not really have much of a political commitment. Our governments did not step up and say that this would be an issue they would address, or that they would step up and perhaps offer support for survivors too. So it fell on the bureaucracy to some extent, as well as to service providers in civil society to step up and respond to these needs. And I'm going to share with you 3 cases where gender mainstreaming became an interesting approach in the way they actually dealt with violence cases. So in a city called Pune, which is close to Mumbai, those of you who are not from India but are familiar with Mumbai will know this. So Pune went through a massive spike in domestic violence cases somewhere around March and April. And the police realized that shifting the survivor out of home was dangerous for 2 reasons. One, they were already vulnerable because they'd faced violence and had absolutely nowhere to go when they were shifted outside because of quarantine centers and not having local or immediate family. And 2, they also faced the reprisals and the stigma if they had to go back home to get the things they needed, or even access their children if that was the nature of their household. So instead of shifting the survivor out, they began to shift the perpetrator and institutionally quarantine them in spaces that were actually filled with people who tested positive for COVID. Now, while on the one hand, this put the fear of God in several perpetrators to not be necessarily violent in those times, it also led to an interesting phenomenon. More and more families that faced the instances of violence began to seek conciliation measures, began to look at mediation, began to look at the interlocution of maybe a relative or a friend or somebody who could help them address the ongoing violence in the family. Now, this was particularly interesting, but not necessarily generalizable, simply because reprisals can continue. And just because a perpetrator is removed temporarily, the larger undercurrent of violence may not be addressed. But the fact that some families went forward to seek a way to address the larger undercurrent really shows that there is hope for a method like this to find fruition. A second interesting case study was the National Commission for Women, which is a division that is dedicated to women's rights, came up with a WhatsApp helpline, which allowed for women to just shoot a 1-word text message to a WhatsApp number. Depending on the state the woman was situated in at the time, they were able to map help and offer support for survivors in those times. But unfortunately, the downside of this is an interesting phenomenon that seems to exist in India. Perhaps in other countries, I haven't explored this, but if it's true, I'd love to know more about that separately. But an interesting phenomenon is that there are 2 different kinds of phones in the average household that falls in the below poverty line or perhaps closer to the low income groups. Now, this phenomenon of 2 phones involves what's known as the husband's phone and the wife's phone, which means the husband's phone is really the one that's a smartphone, that's more accessible, that has access to the internet and data, and therefore something like WhatsApp is usable on that phone. On the contrary, the wife's phone is really just a functional device that allows her to make phone calls, receive phone calls, and that's about it. So in several of the instances where women tried to find help, they didn't have a device to be able to send out that text message. Now, this problem also manifested in a different reality, in a different situation where a woman tried to make a phone call to the police officers in the area when she received information through community radio, telling her that if anybody faced domestic violence, they were allowed to give the police a call and the police would intervene. Now, she made a phone call from her husband's phone when he was bathing, and at the time, the police said they would get to her. But instead of getting to her, they made a phone call back to the number, and the husband picked up. And that increased the extent of violence she had faced. So what I'm trying to say over here is that on paper, these policies may seem incredibly supportive, and we have wonderful ideas to start with. But the impact fails if it's not going to be intersectional, if it's not going to acknowledge unique lived experiences. So the idea of treating women or the idea of treating non-binary people as a homogeneous group then automatically fails when you're trying to establish a strategy. Another interesting strategy that came about with civil society, and this was particularly useful because it spoke to the idea of mainstreaming strategies to address gender-based violence, was entirely civil society-led. So when the lockdown happened in my city, we reached out to civic workers who were still allowed to walk around in the city, in the streets, to support people with access to medicines or groceries, or even just give them information on the testing centers as they came up. So we reached out to the civic society, civic workers, and we said to them, if you have access to people who go to communities where there is a lot of violence, because you probably know where you see the nerve centers of violence taking place in the household, we'd like you to speak to the women there and ask them, through private conversations, of course, and ask them to tie a cloth outside their doors to indicate when they're facing violence. And then to take the other side of this message, which is to let the police know that if they see doors with a cloth tied outside of it, to intervene and to support and rescue the woman. So this was extremely successful because the act of tying a cloth outside the door was very innocuous. Most husbands didn't notice. Some husbands thought that the women were being clever about drying particular pieces of clothing that were not drying out already after being washed. And so they never really bothered or asked why the women were doing this. There was no fear of reprisal. And in that time, close to about 50 women found access to support, whether that was a lawyer, whether that was moving to a shelter home, or just relocating to a mother's home or a sister's home close by with the help of the police. Now, a similar strategy was adopted by the police itself in a state called Telangana, which is down south, where a police officer received a distress call because she's particularly vocal about these issues on Twitter. So a survivor reached out to her and said to her that she was facing violence and she really needed a way for it to stop. Now, this survivor was in a very different city, in a very different state from where the police officer was. But she coordinated with other police officers and managed to get the young woman out of a dangerous situation. And the next job that had come up was the mother of the young woman who lived in the state of the police officer asked for the young woman to be brought to her. Now, this inspired the police officer to set up what she called the mobile safety vehicle, which has successfully been able to repatriate several people, not just women, not just non-binary people, but also men facing violence in this time in the space of a family setup or perhaps with roommates wherever they were staying, to actually find help and to get away from violence, at least for the temporary present, before they take larger action to get away from such situations for good. Now, when we look at these examples, and I'm still sticking with the fact that this is heavily anecdotal because research is still underway to understand exactly how much violence has happened, what nature this violence has taken, where it's been most prevalent, and in what particular ways. One of the things that has really stood out in this time is civil society rising up. And the good part about civil society is that they know exactly where the shoe pinches. They know exactly what the problem looks like for them. And therefore, a strategy that they want to address a situation with speaks to their needs immediately. The thing about addressing gender-based violence is largely the sense of conflation at the policy level of gender and woman, when the truth really is that gender is a fluid identity and speaks to a massive ocean of identities and is not just restricted to women alone or a single idea of woman as well. So in the process of gender mainstreaming, if these examples are anything to go by, it is necessary to employ intersectionality both as a means as well as an ends to understand the impact of a mainstreaming policy. So when we're going to look at addressing certain communities, centering that community is absolutely necessary. So this would be my first recommendation. Center the community you are trying to serve. Even if you're establishing the fact that certain legal regimes are in place for domestic violence or certain approaches are acceptable for filing a charge against a person who is responsible for gender-based violence, you want to acknowledge all of the challenges the survivor faces to be able to get there, to file charges, to press charges, or to even access help. So to understand that, you really need to look into examining the nature of the lived experiences of the individuals. So center the community. The second thing is to decentralize policy, to be able to allow some measure of self-governance by the community itself in addressing its needs through a mainstream lens. When I say that the political will has been absent in addressing domestic violence, I'm also trying to be cognitive and accepting of the fact that it's impossible to have a one-size-fits-all policy to address something as enormous as gender-based violence that looks so different in our everyday lives, even if we share the same narrative. So it's important to decentralize leadership in addressing something like gender-based violence to the community itself, or as far as possible, to as closely as possible to the community itself. The third important thing to bear in mind is to acknowledge the fact that certain services must remain essential regardless of the nature of the situation. We do know, and there's been enough literature, there's been enough research to testify to the fact that times of violence, times of in the form of war, armed conflict, times of disaster, whether that's natural disaster or man-made disaster, like times of now we're dealing with the pandemic or the bomb blast that happened, sorry, not the bomb blast, but the explosion that happened in Lebanon. The essence that I'm trying to bring out here is that these situations increase vulnerabilities. They take what has already existed in peacetime and then exacerbate those vulnerabilities significantly, making those inequalities exceptionally heavy to bear. So it's important to understand that this peacetime continuum that extends into maybe wartime or disaster time or emergency time automatically leads to certain communities being doubly vulnerable. And in these times of vulnerability, it is essential for certain services to remain essential, to be treated that way, to not be closed down. Domestic violence doesn't take a holiday, neither does gender-based violence of any form, and nor should access to those resources. Of course, in times like a pandemic, staffing and shelter homes can be very difficult to maintain in times like these, but certain approaches have to be thought about well in advance, taking lessons from previous instances where there have been failures or learning experiences to be able to move forward. And finally, it's always important to acknowledge that those for whose community you are creating a policy are the best judges of its impact, rather than to assume by just mere numbers. And I say this with some understanding of working with communities that have faced gender-based violence on several occasions. It is not enough for us to say that we've established a helpline and that's all that a survivor needs. What's essential is to acknowledge whether the accessibility of that helpline is really possible and what are the barriers that prevent that from happening. So gender mainstreaming is really not just about establishing a policy approach that you think will work for a community, but really to center that community and to acknowledge the intersectional factors that prevent that community from accessing or benefiting from those policies, sorry. So that is my presentation. I look forward to questions. I also want to share with you at this point that at the Gender Security Project, we are mapping the instances of gender-based violence that have taken place world over through what we call the COVID GBV tracker. I will make sure to share the link with you on chat, and we welcome organizations and individuals to look it up and to help us in the data collection process. Thank you so much for your time and for listening. And thank you, Emilio Mo, for having me.